72-year-old Arthur Hale learned life's cruelest lesson far too late. The greatest pain in this world is not burying your lifelong spouse. It's surviving her, only to be systematically drained, isolated, and betrayed by the own child you raised and trusted with everything. For 48 years, his wife Ellen was the quiet, unshakable center of his entire world. A warm, steady-hearted retired teacher, she'd turned their modest suburban Ohio home into a place of routine, comfort, and pure love. Arthur spent 38 grueling years as a mechanical engineer, working overtime through freezing Midwest winters, sacrificing personal time and comfort to build financial stability for his family. He'd always believed their hard-earned peace was permanent. After a lifetime of labor and devotion, he and Ellen were finally supposed to rest, travel, and enjoy their well-deserved retirement side by side. Arthur truly thought nothing could hurt him more than losing the woman who'd loved and anchored him for nearly 50 years. He was wrong. 3 months prior, sudden cardiac complications took Ellen's life. Overnight, Arthur's orderly, gentle existence crumbled into hollow silence. The house no longer echoed with her soft singing while cooking, her quiet morning coffee chatter, or her nightly habit of straightening the living room pillows. Every hallway, every shelf, every framed family photograph screamed her absence. Grief settled heavy over his 72-year-old frame, fogging his mind, draining his motivation, and turning even basic daily tasks into overwhelming burdens. Alone for the first time in his entire adult life, Arthur was fragile, adrift, and utterly vulnerable. That was when his only daughter, Meredith, stepped in, and Arthur believed she was his saving grace. At 46, Meredith had always been his pride, quiet, agreeable, and seemingly devoted throughout her childhood and adulthood. She'd never given her parents reason for. After Ellen's funeral, she showed up every single day without fail. She brought home-cooked meals, cleaned the neglected house, sorted piles of unopened mail, scheduled all of Arthur's doctor appointments, and sat patiently with him through hours of numb, wordless. Her husband Russell accompanied her faithfully, handling yard work, home repairs, and grocery runs, always light, always full, always willing to lighten Arthur. To neighbors, church friends, and distant relatives, Meredith and Russell were the definition of perfect, caring family support. Everyone praised Arthur for having such a loyal, responsible daughter who dropped her own life to care for her grieving father. In Arthur's broken state, he clung to their presence like a lifeline. After losing his wife, he'd feared lonely, empty days, but Meredith made him safe, loved, and he trusted her the way only a loving father can trust a child. He had no idea the kindness wrapping around him was nothing more than a slow, calculated. It all began with harmless-sounding requests, subtle enough to slip past grief-clouded. Meredith noticed Arthur could barely handle his finances. Stacks of pension statements, utility bills, and tax documents piled up his desk. Depression and sorrow blurred focus. Numbers felt meaningless. Deadlines overwhelming. One evening, sitting gently beside him on the couch, Meredith offered to take over all his management. "Dad, you've worked your whole life to press." Her tone warm and passionate. "You don't need to stress about bills and pay right now. Just rest and heal. Let me handle everything. I'll pay every bill on time, track your pension, and keep all your accounts secure. You won't have to worry a thing." Overwhelmed with gratitude, Arthur agreed without hesitation. He signed every form she placed before him without reading a word, granting her full, unrestricted access checking account, lifelong savings, and his monthly enduring pension, the retirement fund he'd spent decades building for his page. He thought he was letting his daughter love and care for him. In truth, he was handing her the keys to his. Once Meredith controlled finances, her manipulation folded. She never stopped acting inattentive, but her behavior grew strategic and controlling. Her first step was isolating Arthur from every person who could mean. She began intercepting all eye contact. Arthur's older sister, Margaret, his closest family member 70 years, called repeatedly to check on him and invite her. With always answered, politely lying that Arthur was too exhausted, too depressed, or too weak. She hung up before Arthur's phone rang. When neighbors stopped by with sympathy cards and baked goods, Meredith greeted them at the porch, thanked them warmly, and sent them away before they could step inside. Bit by bit, she erased Arthur's entire support system. At first, Arthur did growing silence. Grief made him withdrawn. He no longer attended his community coffee group, no longer called friends, visited family. He assumed everyone was simply giving him space to mourn. Whenever he mentioned reconnecting relatives or neighbors, Meredith him. "People's visits will reopen your pain. she would whisper, hooking his arm soothingly. "Don't need outsiders right now. You have me and Russell, real family." Weak, lone, and desperate for guidance, Arthur believed her. He surrendered all social interaction, all outside contact, and allowed himself to become entirely dependent on son-in-law. With no witnesses, no outside voices, and no one to check his true living situation, Meredith gained complete, control over his life. Arthur was fully isolated. She began erasing every trace of Ellen's memory to clear exploitation. She started small, removing Ellen's hand-knit blankets, scarves, and handmade decor, claiming clutter worsened his mental state. Next, she cleared away Ellen's vintage trinkets, ceramic collection, and favorite kitchenware, telling Arthur she was sent to help him heal. Each time, Arthur nodded numbly, too tired to question her decisions. The first real crack in his trust arrived on a gray Saturday. After months in Ellen's personal belongings, Arthur finally felt through her vanity. He wanted a precious memory to hold close, the pearl necklace he'd gifted her with wedding anniversary. She'd worn it to every holiday, every family gathering, every over 2 decades. It was not in money, in love and memory. Shuffled slowly into the master bedroom, Arthur opened his antique wooden jewelry box, one she'd owned since her youth. Possessions. Heart dropped instantly. The necklace was gone. So were her wedding day diamond earrings, her tiny gold locket holding their first family photo, and that held her wedding band. All that remained was worthless costume jewelry, filled the empty space. Arthur's hands trembled. A cold suspicion cut through his grief, clearer and sharper than emotion he'd felt since it died. This was not clean. This was not fine. This theft, calculated, deliberate, disrespect memory of his late wife. Pieces of the past clicked brutally into place. Meredith's secretive sorting, her comments about selling unused items, insistence on clearing out his things, Russell's quiet, unwavering silence through every change. Arthur sank weakly onto his mind spinning. He had given his daughter over every dollar he owned, cut him off from family and friends. He'd allowed erase his wife's most precious memories. It had left him completely defenseless. Yet in that moment, he knew this was not the end. The missing jewelry, the drained financial freedom, the cruel isolation, all of it was just preparation. Meredith spent months stripping him of independence, support and sentimental anchors not for quick profit, and him for something far worse. As he sat frozen in his empty bedroom, hearing Meredith's car pull into the driveway for her visit, Arthur finally woke up. The grieving old man who'd blindly trusted his child was gone. In his place, who now understood the terrifying truth. His had been planning his downfall all along. The quiet, gentle grief he'd thought was his greatest suffering was nothing compared to the cold, calculated betrayal closing in around him. And the worst part of it all? Meredith had severely underestimated the quiet resilience inside her 72-year-old father. After discovering Ellen's missing jewelry, Arthur Hale could no longer entertain naive hope. Meredith's gentle, caring facade fractured, revealing cold, calculated self-interest beneath. Grief had blurred his judgment long enough, letting him mistake manipulation for devotion. Now watchful and wary, he tracked every word and move from his daughter and son-in-law, and what he found turned sorrow into quiet anger. Arthur chose silence. A premature confrontation would drive Meredith to cover her tracks, destroying his chance to expose the full extent of her scheme. At 72, he still possessed the discipline forged over decades as an engineer. He would wait, observe, and gather evidence. Meredith never noticed the shift. Confident in her control, she viewed Arthur as a broken, grieving elder, docile and easily swayed. She had cut him off from family, cleared Ellen's treasured belongings out of the house, and seized full power over his finances. Gradually, she grew bolder, no longer hiding her greed behind polite warmth. One forgotten paper bank statement laid bare her financial abuse. Arthur's pension, meant for his medical costs and daily needs, was steadily drained for purchases that benefited only Meredith and Russell. Upscale clothing, spa visits, luxury groceries, and payments toward Russell's truck loan. While she splurged with his retirement savings, she repeatedly scolded Arthur for spending modestly on basic necessities. The hypocrisy stung deep. Arthur locked the statement away as his first piece of evidence, continuing to act the compliant father to lull her into complacency. Meredith intensified her efforts to isolate. Terrified outside contact would expose her plot. After weeks of failed attempts, Arthur's sister Margaret finally reached him by phone, desperate to check on his well-being. Before Arthur could speak, Meredith stormed in, snatched the phone, and lied smoothly to Margaret, claiming Arthur was too emotionally fragile to receive calls. She ended the conversation and shut down his phone completely. Arthur found she had erased nearly every contact from his siblings, friends, neighbors, all. Only her and Russell's numbers. She intended to make him entirely dependent on the two. Days later, Meredith brought an antique dealer to the house to sell Ellen's. These pieces were not. They held 48 years of shared, the home they had built as newlyweds and raised their child. Arthur begged her to stop, but Meredith blocked his way, insisting holding on to the past prevented him. Once the furniture was loaded onto the truck, she pocketed all the money from the sale without offering Arthur. In that hollow, half-empty home, Arthur understood. This was never about helping him grieve. Meredith wanted total domination. She would erase every trace of Ellen, sever all his lifelong actions, drain his savings little, until he had no one to rely on. Still, she made one critical mistake. She constantly underestimated her father. Arthur's grief faded, replaced by quiet. He documented every stolen item, every lie, every unauthorized withdrawal. He endured her lectures and controlled patiently, letting her believe. He suspected the theft and isolation were merely stepping stones for something. One evening after Meredith had left, Arthur heard a faint noise from the upstairs guest room, where Meredith often. He climbed cautiously. The door stood slightly ajar, and on the bed lay a thick letter. Neat handwriting on the cover carried a single word. Everything suddenly. This final goal, every act of deception, cruelty, was designed to win legal authority over him, stripping him of all rights to his money. Before Arthur could examine the papers, a car door slammed away. Meredith and Will were coming back. Arthur froze. He had uncovered her darkest secret, found him there. The silent war between father and daughter would bout into open, irreversible conflict. Arthur retreated silently down the stairs, his heart hammering in his chest. He barely made it to the living room armchair and settled into his usual quiet posture before the front door creaked open. Meredith and Russell stepped inside, chatting casually, completely unaware their deepest secret had nearly been discovered. Arthur forced a blank, weary expression, pretending he had spent the evening lost in lonely thoughts of Ellen. Every muscle in his body was taut with tension. He knew the manila folder marked Guardianship was proof of a plot far more dangerous than theft and isolation. As Meredith wandered toward the staircase, Arthur fought to keep his gaze neutral. She headed straight for the guest bedroom. Minutes later, he heard a drawer slide closed. She had secured the folder back into its hiding spot. Once she returned downstairs, she carried on as normal, asking if he had eaten, commenting on the quiet house, offering empty words of comfort. Her performance was flawless, yet Arthur could now see through every layer of her act. Every gentle gesture, every concerned question was a performance meant to reinforce the image of a devoted daughter caring for a vulnerable widower. That night, Arthur could not sleep. He lay awake replaying everything he had learned. Guardianship. If Meredith successfully petitioned the court for legal guardianship, she would gain full legal control over him. She could manage all his assets, make every medical decision, control where he lived, and limit who he was allowed to see. Once that order was signed, he would lose nearly all autonomy. The stolen jewelry, drained pension fund, severed family contacts, and the removal of Ellen's belongings were all carefully laid groundwork. She needed to convince officials that Arthur was mentally unfit to manage his own affairs. Every small manipulation over the past months was evidence she planned to present to a judge. Arthur understood her strategy clearly. She had created a closed narrative. To outsiders, she was the selfless daughter who stepped up after her mother's death. He was portrayed as a grief-broken elderly man unable to function independently. With his family cut off, there would be no one to contradict her version of events in court. Without witnesses, without outside contact, her lies would stand unchallenged. In the following days, Arthur grew even more. He dared not raise his. He continued to listen quietly while Meredith lectured him about, nodded when she made decisions for the household, and avoided direct confrontation. At the same time, he began systematically building his defense. He kept a small notebook tucked deep inside his closet, writing down every stolen item, every suspicious bank transaction, every instance she blocked his calls to Emily. He noted dates, conversations, and every hollow excuse. He also started quietly testing her. He casually mentioned wanting to schedule a meeting with his attorney to review. The moment the words left mouth, Meredith's demeanor. She forced a light laugh, trying to dismiss it. "There's no for that," she said smoothly. "Your will is all in order. Getting lawyers involved right now will only stress you out while you're grieving. We can handle all these matters together later when you're... Her overreaction confirmed Arthur's fears. A lawyer would have the power to investigate his finances and question his living conditions, threatening her entire guardianship plan. She wanted to delay any independent legal contact for as long. Shortly after, Arthur saw another woman. Meredith started asking repeated questions about his sleeping habits, his mood, and his memory. She pressed him to recount small day details, watching closely as he answered. At first, he did not understand why she was distant. It slowed on him. She was gathering statements she intended to claim he suffered from confusion, poor focus, and emotional instability to strengthen her core. Russell remained a quiet, constant backdrop. He rarely spoke up, seldom argued, and mostly followed. Arthur suspected Russell knew every detail of the scheme. He benefited equally from the stolen pension money and the improved lifestyle it funded. His silent ignorance, complicity. Arthur realized he could no longer wait for a perfect opportunity. He needed independent access to his finances, a secure way to store evidence, and a channel to contact his family without Meredith intercepting every message. He could not risk using a regular phone, which she had already purged and could monitor at any time. He needed a... One morning, he told Meredith he wanted to walk to the neighborhood convenience store to buy these. She hesitated, seemingly reluctant to let the house alone, but she could not find a reasonable excuse to walk. She made him promise to return quickly, reminding him not. Once outside, Arthur moved slowly toward the shop. He visited a small discount store and purchased a cheap paid mobile phone, paying in cash from a small reserve he had hidden long before. He slipped the phone into his inner jacket pocket and returned home before Meredith. Back inside the house, he waited until Meredith and the evening. Locked in his bedroom, he on the new phone. He memorized his sister Margaret's number and dialed her. When she answered, her voice filled with shock. She had feared something terrible had happened to him after months. Arthur spoke cautiously, slow. He explained the essential details, warning her to be careful contacting channels. He told her Meredith was attempting to isolate him in control of his assets, and he feared she planned guardianship. Margaret was horrified. She promised to keep their conversation secret and offered to so she could. For the first time in months, Arthur no longer felt completely alone. Still, he knew what was not enough. He needed tangible financial proof. He needed official bank records that documented the unauthorized withdrawals Meredith had made from his pension account. He could not ask Meredith to pull statements, as she would dislocate her. He went in person. A few days later, he had another excuse. He claimed he needed to pick up prescription medication from the pharmacy across town. Meredith agreed to drive him, though she insisted on accompanying him inside. That ruined his chance to speak privately with bank staff. Arthur held back his frustration for another opening. Tensions between father and daughter slowly simmering exchanges. Meredith sensed a change in Arthur's attitude. He was more alert, more thoughtful, and occasionally pushed back against her decisions. He grew slightly more watchful, checking in on him more frequently, and regularly glanced through his personal stepped out of the room. Fortunately, she never discovered his hidden note-paid phone. One afternoon, Meredith left to run errands alone, keep an eye on Arthur. Russell settled in front of the television, directed by sports coverage. Arthur recognized this narrow window of opportunity. He told Russell he'd short walk around the block. Russell waved him off without much thought, too absorbed to pay close attention. Wait for his bank branch. Once he arrived privately with a banking officer, he requested complete copies of all activity over the past several months. He explained suspected unauthorized withdrawals and asked the request confidential. The banker agreed to compile the records and contact him securely. Arthur left lifted from his shoulders. Hard going to be in his hands. When he returned home, Russell barely gone longer than expected. Arthur acted as he had simply enjoyed a leisurely stroll. He understood that time was running out. Meredith would file for guardianship sooner or later. Once legal proceedings began, the battle would turn public, and the risk of losing control over his own life would become immediate. That evening, Arthur caught Meredith quietly on the phone in the hallway. She lowered her voice when she saw him, but he caught fragments of the conversation. She mentioned assessments, paperwork, and proving instability. Every word confirmed his worst fears. She was actively consulting someone, likely an attorney, to application. After she finished the call, she smiled at him as if nothing had happened. Arthur returned the smile, masking the cold dread settling in his bones. The silent war was entering its final stage. Meredith believed she held all the power, convinced her father was too old and isolated to mount any meaningful resistance. She underestimated how fiercely he would fight to protect freedom, his late wife's memory, the lifetime building. Arthur retreated to his bedroom, pulled out his hidden notebook, and wrote down every fragment of the conversation he had overheard. He placed the notebook alongside the prepaid phone, where Meredith would never find it. He knew he could not delay much longer. Soon he would have to kill her. When that moment came, he would be ready with evidence, witnesses, and a clear understanding of her ruthless hidden plan. Arthur carried the weight of newfound evidence inside him like a secret flame. The bank had promised to compile months of transaction records, and his prepaid phone remained his only secure link to Margaret. Still, he dared not relax. Meredith's awareness of his subtle shift in demeanor grew sharper each day. She stopped leaving him alone for long stretches, and Russell was instructed to keep constant watch whenever she stepped out to handle errands. Every morning, Arthur fell into the same routine he had constructed to avoid suspicion. He rose slowly, spoke softly, accepted the meals Meredith placed before him, and nodded obediently to every suggestion she made. To any outside observer, he was exactly the grieving, passive widower she described. Behind his calm expression, he mapped out every possible opening to strengthen his case. The guardianship application loomed over him. He knew once Meredith filed the paperwork, the burden would shift. Judges often lean on the family member who appears organized and caring, and she had spent months building that false reputation. Several days passed before the bank called his prepaid number. The officer informed him the full account history was ready for pickup. Arthur's heart raced. This stack of papers would lay out every unauthorized transfer, every luxury purchase charged to his pension, every payment toward Russell's vehicle. It was the most concrete proof he could obtain. The challenge was finding a way to collect the documents without Meredith tagging along. He crafted a careful list. He told Meredith he needed to visit the cemetery to leave fresh flowers on Ellen's grave. He knew she would hesitate to refuse. Denying a grieving father access to his wife's resting place would contradict her selfless public image. As predicted, though she insisted Russell drive him and wait in the park, Arthur planned a course. He asked Russell to stop briefly at a small florist shop. Once they pulled into the park, he claimed he needed to use the public restroom beside. He told Russell he would be back in a few. Instead, he cut through a side pedestrian path toward the bench, a short 5-minute way. He rushed inside, collected the thick packet of bank statements, and slipped the envelope deep inside his lining. His hands trembled slightly as he thanked her. He didn't linger. He hurried back to the florist, purchased a simple bouquet, and returned. Russell never suspected. At the cemetery, Arthur knelt by Ellen. He set the flowers down and whispered a quote. He would not let Meredith erase her memory, nor waste the money they had saved together over 4 years. Standing there, he resolved that he would not allow anyone to take away. Drive home, Russell remained quiet, absorbed in work. Arthur stared out the window, reviewing the list of evidence: stolen jewelry, sold antique furniture, erased phone contacts, months of misused pension funds, and Meredith's ongoing preparations for ship. One critical remained. All of his proof was temptation. He needed a neutral witness who could testify to Meredith's pattern of isolation. Margaret was family, and her statement might be dismissed as biased. That night, Arthur contacted Margaret again. He explained his progress and asked whether she could arrange for a trusted, impartial third party. Margaret suggested an old mutual friend, a retired social worker who had known the Fids. She agreed to reach out discreetly and see if the woman would be willing to observe Arthur's. Unfortunately, Meredith sensed a change. She noticed Arthur spent more time in his bedroom, and he seemed less willing to volunteer information about. She began searching his bedroom when he stepped out to take walks. Arthur barely avoided discovery when she rummaged through his closet. After that close call, he moved the notebook, prepaid phone, and bank records into a hollowed space inside an old wooden toolbox stored in the garage, a location Meredith. Tensions boiled over evening. Meredith brought up the topic of future casually. She spoke about how difficult it was for him to bills alone, how clouded his judgment, and how much simpler life would be if someone handled all the complex work for him. Arthur carefully. I appreciate your concern, but I am still capable of. Myths faded. Dad, you don't realize how overwhelmed you are. Mom's passing hit you harder than anyone expected. What if you make costly mistakes with your money? I have managed our finances for nearly 50 years before Ellen died. Understand how to budget. Russell glanced between them comfortably but said nothing. Meredith quickly shifted back to a gentle tone, yet cold. You are letting pride in the way of sensible planning. I want to protect you. The conversation ended there, but Arthur understood the warning beneath her soft words. She was testing his will to surrender control. If he continued resisting, she might excel. A few days later, and reached out. She was willing to visit under the pretense of an old acquaintance. Stop condolences. Arthur waited anxiously. Arranged afternoon. When the woman arrived, Meredith greeted her politely, maintaining her persona. She never left her side during the entire visit, carrying every conversation, speaking privately. The visitor picked up subtle signs of tension, yet she treatment. After the guest left, confronted Arthur. I didn't want her to drop by unannounced. How did she know him? Arthur shrugged. Margaret must, and I could use some company. Meredith fully believed his answer. That night, she announced new rules. She would screen all incoming calls, and any visitor approved by her first. She also told Arthur his solo walks would be limited to short trips around the block, accompany him every time. Her noose tightened further. Arthur knew time was running thin. He held all the paperwork he needed, yet he could not confrontation inside the house. If Meredith grew desperate, she might lock his belongings away, cut or destroy his evidence. He needed a way to leave imminently until the court hearing. The idea slowly formed. He would ask Margaret to help a local elder law attorney. Once he secured legal representation, his lawyer could formally demand Meredith cease interfering with his finances and personal contact. Legal notice forced her to pause her guardian, at least temporarily. Before he could act, Arthur overheard Meredith in a guest room late one night. Frustrated by his growing resistance, contact a lawyer on his own. Russell suggested they move forward with filing the guardianship papers as soon as possible, or could organize any opposition. Arthur's blood ran cold. They planned to strike first. He could no longer wait patiently. Early the next morning, he told Meredith he felt unwell and needed to see his doctor. She offered to drive him, and Arthur agreed. This was his chance. Once they arrived at the medical clinic, he would ask staff for assistance contacting Margaret and transport away from the house. As they prepared to, Arthur glanced toward the garage. His evidence was hidden inside the toolbox. If he left now without retrieving it, Meredith might find and destroy it. He faced a terrible choice: risk sneaking back to collect the documents, or flee if he needed to defend himself in court. Arthur weighed his options as he waited by the front door for Meredith to grab her keys. Leaving without the bank records, notebook, and prepaid phone meant entering any future legal battle empty-handed. Meredith's word would carry far more weight without tangible proof of her financial exploitation, yet delaying the trip to retrieve evidence would arouse suspicion. Every second felt precarious. He settled on a quick compromise. He told Meredith he needed to grab a light jacket from the garage. She nodded, checking her phone, distracted by messages. Arthur hurried into the garage, opened the old toolbox, and stuffed all his documents and the prepaid phone into the inner pocket of the jacket. He closed the container carefully, erasing any trace it had been disturbed, and returned to the car. During the drive to the doctor's office, Arthur remained quiet. Meredith chatted casually about minor household chores, acting as if their tense dinner argument had never occurred. She still believed she maintained complete control over his world. She had no idea he carried everything required to expose her scheme, hidden right beside her in the passenger seat. When they arrived at the clinic parking lot, Arthur said he wanted to enter alone. He claimed he preferred discussing sensitive health matters privately. Meredith hesitated. She clearly wanted to stay close to monitor every conversation, but she could not create a scene in public. She agreed to wait in the vehicle, on the condition he text her once his appointment concluded. As soon as he stepped inside the clinic lobby, Arthur approached the front desk nurse. He spoke in a low, steady voice and explained he was facing potential financial abuse and unlawful isolation by his daughter. He asked if staff could help him contact his sister Margaret and arrange safe transportation away from his home. The nurse took his situation seriously and summoned a clinic social worker. The social worker listened carefully as Arthur summarized Meredith's action: stolen heirlooms, drained pension funds, blocked family communication, and the planned guardianship filing. He showed copies of bank statements from his jacket. The social worker confirmed they could reach Margaret immediately. They also advised him not to return to the house with Meredith. If he went back, he risked being confined and prevented from leaving. Margaret rushed to the clinic within 40 minutes. When she saw Arthur, she fought back. She had feared Meredith would succeed in cutting all contact in day. The two spoke privately, and Margaret arranged for him to stay temporarily. She owned a small guest suite with a separate entrance, making it impossible for Meredith to intrude on. Meanwhile, Meredith grew increasingly anxious waiting. She sent multiple text messages that received no reply. She eventually walked into the clinic to search. The front desk staff informed her he had already left. Meredith's composure mattered. She demanded to know where he had gone, yet staff members were bound by privacy rules and refused to share. Furious, Meredith returned home. She immediately began calling Arthur's regular cell phone, which he had left behind. When he answered, she realized she had lost. Her carefully constructed plan was such jeopardy. She began brainstorming damage control. She prepared a story to tell. Arthur had suffered an emotional down, been manipulated by Margaret, and was refusing to listen to. At Margaret's house, Arthur finally breathed freely for the first time in months. He spread out all his evidence across the guest room table and sorted documents logically. Margaret helped him search online for local elder law attorneys. After reviewing several reviews and credentials, they scheduled a consultation with a lawyer specializing in elder financial abuse and guardianship. The consultation took place 2 days later. Arthur detail. The attorney examined the bank statements, read the notes from his notebook, and listened to the timeline of Meredith's ISTICs. The lawyer confirmed Meredith's actions fit a clear pattern of elder exploitation. She warned Arthur the fight would not be easy. Once Meredith submitted chip paperwork, the court would schedule a hearing, and Meredith would present her version first. The attorney advised Arthur to take immediate action. She would send a cease and desist letter to Meredith, demanding she stop all unauthorized use of his funds, cease blocking communication between Arthur and his family, and halt any progress on the guardianship application. The letter would serve as official to court. When Meredith received the attorney's letter, she was anger. She told Arthur repeatedly, leaving long, accused messages. She claimed he was betraying her after all the care she had given his death. She insisted Margaret had poisoned his daughter. Arthur didn't respond to any calls. His lawyer instructed him to limit all direct contact to written messages. Desperate to regain control, Meredith attempts house. Margaret to let her inside. A heated argument erupted on the front lawn. Next, the confrontation. Meredith loudly claimed Arthur was mentally needed supervision. Margaret firmly told her she could not come onto the property without permission. This public altercation became a small piece of evidence. Several neighbors later agreed they were willing to provide statements if required. Rated her plan. Within a week, she formally filed a petition for permanent guardianship in the local county court. Copies of the paper arrived at the attorney's office. In her filing, Meredith described Arthur as chronically grief-impaired, prone to poor judgment, and unable to manage finances or daily decisions safely. She referenced his refusal to return home as proof of impaired mental capacity. She also attached misleading accounts of their conversations, carefully edited to manipulation. Arthur's lawyer immediately filed an official response contesting the guardianship petition. She submitted portions of the bank records and witness contact information to the court clerk. The judge assigned to the case ordered a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. Both sides would want to present initial evidence, and a court-appointed evaluator would be sent to conduct an independent assessment of making ability. Arthur understood the visit would be critical. Meredith would try to reach the evaluator first to share her one-sided narrative. Arthur needed to remain calm, coherent, and organized during the assessment. He practiced explaining his timeline clearly, without anger or emotional outbursts. Knowing displays of frustration could betort Meredith's claims. As the hearing date drew near, Arthur grouped Ellen's stolen belongings. Many antique furniture pieces and jewelry had already been sold to second-hand dealers. Recovering them would be difficult, but his lawyer explained he could pursue civil claims to recover financial compensation for the value of the stolen heirloom. Late one evening, Margaret received a worrying phone call from a mutual acquaintance. Meredith had been visiting old family friends, spreading her version of the story, painting Arthur as irrational and Margaret as a troublemaker in parent-child affairs. Others were inclined to believe her. Meredith had spent years building as a dependable daughter. Arthur's public opinion would be split. He could not rely on sympathy. He must proof. Before the court evaluator planned to visit, reviewing all his paperwork. He thought, and the life they built together. He never imagined he would end up fighting his own daughter for base freedom. Still, he had no regrets. Surrendering to Guardian, losing everything he had worked for. He stand his ground, present the truth, and try to weigh the evidence fairly. Character count 4271. The morning the court-appointed evaluator arrived at Margaret's home, Arthur rose early. He sorted all evidence into labeled folders, determined to stay calm and factual. His lawyer had repeatedly warned him, evaluators and judges favor steady testimony over emotional outbursts. The neutral capacity assessor arrived promptly at 10. She began with standard questions about Arthur's daily routine, pension income, expenses, and understanding of legal matters. Arthur answered clearly. He explained how he had managed household finances throughout his marriage to Ellen. When the conversation turned to Meredith, he laid out the timeline without exaggeration. He described missing jewelry, sold antique furniture, erased family contacts, and the guardianship folder he discovered in the guest room. He handed over bank statements documenting unauthorized withdrawals. The evaluator examined the records and took extensive notes. At the pivotal question asking why he believed Meredith sought guardianship, Arthur replied evenly. She would gain full control over my accounts, property, and social contacts. Over months, she isolated me from anyone who could contradict her story. I believe she planned to use guardianship to freely access my retirement savings. The evaluator also spoke briefly with Margaret, who confirmed Meredith blocked calls and seized power over Arthur's daily life. Before leaving, she planned to conduct a separate interview with Meredith and submit a written report to the judge ahead of the preliminary hearing. Once the evaluator left, Arthur exhaled. He had remained coherent throughout the assessment. Even so, he knew Meredith would work hard to undermine his statement. She would rehearse her narrative, emphasize Arthur's grief after Ellen's death, and frame all resistance as confusion and poor judgment. As expected, Meredith contacted the evaluator within a day to arrange her interview. She brought prepared notes, family photos, and edited messages claiming Arthur suffered erratic mood. She omitted all mention of sold heirlooms and misused pension funds, focusing entirely on Arthur's loneliness after his wife's funeral. When questioned about suspicious bank transactions, she offered vague excuses, claiming Arthur had approved every expense during period leave. She could not provide any written proof of consent. Days later, the evaluator's preliminary summary arrived for both sides. The specialist confirmed Arthur possessed clear capacity to make financial, housing, and personal decisions. The report highlighted multiple contradictions in Meredith's account and advised the judge to closely examine all financial evidence before considering guardianship. It was a major victory, yet the final outcome rested on the courtroom. Meredith reacted bitterly to the. She contacted her attorney. Frustrated, the evaluator refused to accept her version of events. She began gathering every small moment of Arthur's sadness after Ellen, intending to present these isolated incidents as evidence of permanent mental illness. Arthur's lawyer started preparing him for tests. They practiced direct and cross-examination scenarios. The attorney warned Meredith's counsel would attempt to twist grief into instability. Meanwhile, Arthur launched a civil claim to recover compensation for Ellen's stolen possessions. He tracked down antique dealers who handled sales, and 2 agreed to provide written receipts proving Meredith collected all. These documents became vital bits. Tensions grew between Meredith. Russell feared they would be forced to repay all misappropriated funds if they. He pushed for a settlement hearing. Meredith refused, convinced she could persuade the judge to grant guardianship, and rejected all. The night before the preliminary hearing, Arthur. No parent expects to face their own child in court. Still, he understood at stake the right to choose where he lived, he visited, and how to spend his life. On hearing morning, Arthur arrived with Margaret. Meredith and Russell entered shortly afterward with their counsel, avoiding contact. Meredith's attorney spoke first, outlining the guardianship petition and claiming Arthur's grief left him unable to make. Arthur's lawyer then presented. She submitted bank records, the receipts, witness contact information, and the evaluator's capacity report. She walked the judge through the time isolation, asset theft, and Meredith's premeditated guardianship plan, arguing the petition stemmed from financial gain and care. After arguments, the judge declined to issue an immediate guardianship order. He ordered full evidence disclosure and scheduled a formal evidentiary hearing later. Until then, Arthur retained complete authority over his finances and personal decisions. Meredith was formally ordered to stop restricting his family. Leaving the courthouse, Arthur felt relief. The immediate threat was blocked, yet the battle was over. Meredith showed a sign of surrender. Watching her confer quickly with her attorney, Arthur knew she would spend the coming weeks searching for every possible advantage to turn her. Character 4271. After the preliminary hearing, Meredith turned to increasingly desperate tactics. Unable to secure quick guardianship, she set out to destroy Arthur's credibility. She contacted distant relatives and neighbors, sharing a one-sided account of events. She claimed Margaret manipulated Arthur into turning against his daughter, and prolonged grief prevented him from recognizing who cared for him. Several relatives were swayed and messaged Arthur, urging him to reconcile and settle out of court. Arthur did not argue with them. Without seeing financial evidence, they could not understand the full scale of exploitation. He forwarded their contact details to his lawyer, who prepared neutral evidence summaries ready to share upon request. Meredith repeatedly attempted to contact Arthur directly, ignoring the court's instruction to communicate only through legal representatives. She left emotional voice messages, recalling family memories and invoking Ellen's name, accusing him of destroying their bond over misunderstandings. Arthur saved all recordings as evidence. His lawyer confirmed these unauthorized communications demonstrated Meredith's determination to bypass formal legal channels. One afternoon, Margaret spotted Meredith parked outside her driveway, watching the house for over an hour. Margaret photographed the vehicle and license plate. When confronted by legal counsel, Meredith claimed she only wanted a peaceful conversation. The incident was submitted to the judge in writing, adding to the record of Meredith's aggressive surveillance. As the evidentiary hearing, Arthur's legal team finalized witness statements. The retired social worker, clinic, neighbors who witnessed the lawn art, and 2 antique dealers all agreed to testify. Each could confirm a separate part of Meredith's pattern of manipulation. Meredith's legal strategy focused on discrediting every witness. Her attorney planned to argue antique dealers sought to avoid legal trial. Margaret harbored long-standing family bias, and clinic staff overreacted to a routine domestic dispute. Meredith continued to deny unauthorized withdrawals, repeating her claim of verbal consent despite lacking written. Arthur compiled a complete inventory of missing valuables, supplemented by old photographs proving the items once existed. This material supported his civil claim for compensation. Meanwhile, Russell grew anxious about personal life. He proposed to return remaining unsold property, repay part of the pension funds, and abandon the guardianship petition in exchange for Arthur dropping all. Meredith rejected the idea. A critical complication emerged when Meredith filed a last-minute a handwritten note allegedly signed by Arthur shortly after granting her authority over household assets. Arthur immediately recognized the handwriting as fake. His lawyer hired a forensic handwriter, whose preliminary analysis confirmed the document was almost certainly. When Meredith learned Arthur intended to challenge the note's authenticity, her attorney warned that presenting forged documents to the court could trigger criminal fraud investigation. Even so, she refused to withdraw evidence. The emotional toll weighed heavily. He kept remembering raising Meredith as a child and could not accept she would resort to falsification to seize. Some nights he wondered if reconciliation would ever. Margaret reminded him trust could never be rebuilt while Meredith refused to take. In the final week for the hearing, both sides completed formal evidence. Arthur's lawyer held one final practice session testimony, coaching him to remain steady when facing painful The night hearing, Arthur reviewed the expert report. Multiple differences in letter formation, spacing, and writing rhythm proved the contested note did not match Arthur's verified handwriting samples. If the judge accepted analysis, Meredith's core arguments. Arthur gathered all original evidence folders and the stake be higher. A ruling against guardianship would force Meredith to repay misappropriated funds. If Meredith prevailed, Arthur risked being ordered home and placed under legal control. Rested briefly, knowing the following day would decide. The evidentiary hearing opened in a tense courtroom. A handful of distant family members attended to watch the conflict. Arthur sat beside his lawyer with neatly organized evidence folders. Across the aisle, Meredith and Russell sat counsel. Once the judge called session to order, Meredith's attorney delivers. He restated the guardianship petition, claiming Arthur's grief hurt his judgment, and introduced the disputed handwritten note as proof Arthur willingly granted Meredith authority over princes. Meredith's first witness was an acquaintance. She described Arthur's withdrawn mood after Ellen's funeral and confirmed Meredith frequently visited to offer support. Under cross-examination by Arthur's lawyer, she admitted she never witnessed Meredith controlling Arthur's phone or removing furniture. Her testimony offered limited support and lacked evidence. After Meredith's initial witnesses finished, Arthur's team case. The first antique dealer testified that Meredith arrived alone to sell Ellen's diet and rocking chair, keeping proceeds. He produced receipts signed only by her. The second dealer confirmed purchasing jewelry and vintage decor, stating Meredith claimed full permission to inherited property, with Arthur never present during negotiations. The retail worker followed. She recounted her visit to the house, explaining Meredith never allowed conversation with Arthur and closely directed every exchange in the narrative. Next, the clinic nurse described Arthur's plea for assistance, fear of confinement, and coordinated efforts to contact Margaret and arrange safe transport away from the family home. She confirmed Arthur communicated clearly and understood fully. The most impactful testimony came from the handwriting expert. She laid out detailed comparisons between the contested note and verified samples of Arthur's writing, demonstrating consistent structural differences. Under rigorous cross-examination, she firmly maintained her conclusion that authentic. At this point, Meredith lost her composure and stared at the table. Contact. After all external witnesses spoke, Arthur took the stand. He recounted discovering missing jewelry, the removal of furniture, erased phone contacts, and finding the guest room. He explained how he gathered evidence, purchased a prepaid phone, and his escape. He described the fear of realizing his daughter aimed to legally for his life. Meredith's attorney subjected him to cross-examination, repeatedly attempting to frame his actions as grief-induced confusion and highlighting moral disagreements. Arthur remained calm. He acknowledged sorrow after losing Ellen, but emphasized grief did not remove his ability to manage finance choices. Arthur stepped down, called to testify. Repeated her familiar narrative. All his actions were verbally approved. She acted only out of concern, never isolated him. When questioned about the forged note, she insisted it was genuine and could not explain handwriting discrepancies. Shown dealer receipts proving she kept all sale money, she claimed funds went toward household expenses without any proof. Arthur agreed. Russell briefly testified for Meredith. He confirmed she spent considerable time caring for Arthur, yet hesitated answering specific questions about withdrawals and furniture sales. Arthur's timeline. Once all testimony concluded, both attorneys delivered closing arguments. Meredith's lawyer urged the judge to prioritize family harmony and approve guardianship. Arthur's attorney highlighted financial records, witness statements, handwriting analysis, and the pattern of isolation, arguing the petition was built on manipulation, exploitation, and fraudulence and should be dismissed entirely. The judge announced he would review all materials and release a written ruling within weeks. Court adjourned. As people filed out, Meredith walked directly to Arthur. "You destroyed everything between us. If you'd trusted me, none of this would have happened." Arthur looked at her sadly. "I did trust you. You took advantage of that trust." No more words passed them. Meredith left with Russell. Arthur stood beside Margaret after hours of testimony. He had presented every piece of evidence, yet uncertainty lingered. All he could do now was wait for the judge's final decision. The 2 weeks following the hearing dragged slowly. Arthur struggled to relax. Even with strong witness testimony and expert analysis, he worried family bias might influence the judge's decision. Guardianship disputes often grew complicated by emotional dynamics, and judges hesitated to split families unless exploitation was clearly proven. Arthur filled his days organizing his living space at Margaret's guest house and reviewing hearing notes. Margaret tried to lift his spirits, yet both shared quiet anxiety. They avoided endless speculation, agreeing to wait for official court notification without dwelling on worst-case scenarios. Meredith remained silent throughout the waiting period. She sent no messages, made no attempts to visit, and stopped spreading new claims among relatives. Arthur suspected her attorney advised her to refrain from further action, while the judge deliberated. With no new evidence to strengthen her case, she could only hope inconsistencies over the handwritten note would be overlooked. On the day the ruling was released, Arthur and Margaret traveled to the courthouse to receive official paperwork. Arthur's lawyer read the key conclusions aloud immediately outside the courtroom. First, the judge addressed the guardianship petition. He reviewed the evaluator's capacity report, witness testimony, and all documents. He confirmed Arthur possessed full legal capacity to manage finances, housing, and personal relationships. No credible evidence supported the claim that grief impaired his judgment. The guardianship petition was dismissed with prejudice. Meredith could not refile using the same fact. Next, the judge ruled on financial exploitation. Meredith failed to provide proof Arthur authorized repeated pension withdrawals. Antique dealer receipts confirmed she retained all proceeds from selling Ellen's heirlooms without compensating Arthur. She was ordered to calculate the total misappropriated amount and submit a repayment plan within 30 days. Unsold remaining property must be returned, or she would pay fair market value for all sold items. Regarding the contested handwritten note, the judge accepted the handwriting expert's finding. The document was ruled inauthentic. The judge warned Meredith that submitting falsified evidence could lead to criminal referral, though he declined to press criminal charges at this. Finally, A permanent no-harassment order was. Meredith was forbidden from visiting Margaret's home unaided, following Arthur in public, or sending unsolicited messages. All financial communication must go through legal representatives. Violations would result in contempt of court. Arthur leaned against all, overwhelmed by relief mixed with 1. Retaining control over his life, and Meredith was legally obligated to repay stolen funds. Margaret squeezed his arm. Victory came at the heavy cost of his father-daughter relationship. When Meredith received ruling, she was furious and argued the judgment was. Her attorney explained the evidence against her was overwhelming, and appeals would be expensive and unlikely to succeed. She faced choices: comply with repayment or risk additional. In the following days, Meredith's legal team opened negotiations on a repayment. She claimed she could not repay everything. After several rounds of discussion, both sides reached fixed monthly payments over 5 years to compensate Arthur for stolen money and Ellen's sold. The settlement addendum was submitted to the judge for form. Though the legal ended, emotional wounds were. Arthur never received direct communication with Meredith. All exchanges continued through lawyers. He accepted rebuilding their bond would take immense effort if it was. He could not forgive the theft, manipulation, and guard attempt, yet he refused to carry and. Arthur chose not to return to family home, filled with painful reminders. He began searching for a small, quiet apartment near Margaret to build an independent. He updated his estate plan's attorney, revising his will and establishing strict safeguards to block any future guardianship attempts. He named Margaret his healthcare proxy. One afternoon, Arthur visited Dave. He told her court outcome, explaining he had protected their lifelong savings, and he wondered if Meredith would ever acknowledge it. He left fresh flowers and quietly, grieving the loss of both his wife and the daughter. Weeks passed. Arthur slowly adjusted to life without conflict. Monthly repayment arrived on schedule. He secured an apartment and beginnings. Many relatives misled by Meredith's earlier stories apologized after readings. Still, Arthur understood the chapter was. Repayment would continue for years, and tension remained, but Meredith stayed cautious, focusing on building new routines, and would only consider reconciliation if Meredith took full responsibility for her actions. Months after the judge's ruling, Arthur settled into his new apartment. The space was modest yet comfortable, with large windows and quiet streets. He decorated simply, displaying surviving photos of Ellen and small keepsakes Meredith had not taken. Every possession he owned now represented a choice he freely made, a reminder he had fought successfully to reclaim his autonomy. He built a steady daily routine. He took morning walks, met Margaret for lunch several times weekly, and reconnected with old friends and former co-workers. Many relatives who supported Meredith during the conflict reached out to apologize once they read the official court summary. Arthur accepted apologies without resentment, yet remained cautious about trust. The long dispute taught him to enforce clear boundaries with everyone. Monthly repayments from Meredith arrived automatically through bank transfers, with no attached messages or personal contact. Arthur never initiated communication. He followed his lawyer's advice to limit all interaction strictly to financial matters handled by representatives. Occasionally, he wondered how Meredith and Russell were managing. Legal fees combined with repayment obligations strained their household finances. Still, he would not take responsibility for consequences stemming from choices she made voluntarily. Mutual family members several times suggested mediated meetings between Arthur and Meredith to pursue reconciliation. Arthur thought carefully. He missed the warm father-daughter bond they once shared before Ellen's. But reconciliation required genuine accountability. Until Meredith admitted theft, manipulation, and the guardianship scheme, a meeting would only create fresh pain. He politely declined all mediation proposals for the time being. Arthur worked with his attorney to monitor the repayment plan. If Meredith missed scheduled transfers, legal staff would immediately file enforcement paperwork with the court. For now, all payments arrived on time. Arthur placed recovered funds into a dedicated savings account, reserving the money for future medical expenses, with the remainder planned for Margaret and selected charities in his. Arthur often reflected on everything he discovering missing jewelry, finding the guardianship, the risky escape from the family home, and exhausting court hearings. Isolated and betrayed, he refused to surrender. His engineering background taught him to observe details, gather evidence, and wait patiently for the right moment. Those skills allowed him to defend. He realized grief shaped everyone's actions. Meredith struggled to cope with its death and surrendered to grief. Arthur's own sorrow after losing his wife initially made him vulnerable to manipulation. Yet grief never justified harming another. When autumn arrived, Arthur joined a local community group for older. He met people, enjoyed casual dinners and trips, and built a new social circle separate from past conflicts. He no longer dwelled daily on the pain lingered, but it no longer controlled his mood. He found peace in ordinary moments, quiet morning coffee, walks beneath changing leaves, and conversation. One afternoon, his attorney delivered unexpected. Meredith's legal counsel sent a full inquiry. She wanted to know whether Arthur would consider limited, supervised contact in the future once all repayment. There was no admission of wrongdoing with a message, only a tentative question about reopening. Arthur sat quietly for a long time after receiving. He did not reply. He told his lawyer he needed to consider. Before anything could happen, he required written acknowledgement for actions and a sincere commitment to respect his boundaries. Without foundation, contact risked repeating old cycles. That evening, Arthur sat on his balcony while the sun set. He thought of Ellen, their decades of marriage, and the hopes they once held for her. He could not predict ahead. Perhaps Meredith would eventually accept responsibility, and carefully limited contact. Perhaps the divide between them meant either outcome. He regained his freedom, protected Ellen's memory, and secured financial justice. He built a new life rooted in self-respect and firm boundaries. Whatever happened with Meredith in the years to come, he would move forward slowly, prioritizing his own peace. The bitter family conflict ended in court. Chapter began, defined by conflict, but by independence, and the chance to live the rest of his life terms.